All right, so get ready because today we're going deep on a case that absolutely terrified Boston in the early 1960s, the Boston Strangler. We've got a ton of source material for this deep dive. Articles, investigative reports, even some first-hand accounts to really give you the full picture of this case. I mean, you probably already know the basics, right? A string of brutal murders, all targeting women. The whole city was just paralyzed with fear. But what makes this deep dive so interesting is just how much mystery still surrounds this whole thing.
Yeah, and you know what's really strange about this case? It's not like your typical serial killer profile. The Boston Strangler didn't seem to have a type at all. We're talking 13 women, ages all over the place, 19 to 85, all different walks of life, different backgrounds, ethnicities. It's this detail that really just stumped investigators back then.
That's right. I mean, imagine trying to track down a suspect when the victims are so different. It's
Yeah.
like trying to find a pattern when there just isn't one. And to make the whole thing even creepier, all of these murders happened in the victims' own homes, with no signs of forced entry at all. Like, how did the killer get in? Was it someone they knew? Some really clever stranger? That's the question that just haunted investigators and, of course, fueled all the public fear.
And you know, you have to remember, this was the early 1960s. Forensic science was nothing like it is today. I mean, DNA testing, they could only dream of that back then. So they really relied on eyewitnesses, which we all know can be unreliable. And psychological profiling, well, that was in its infancy back then, really makes you appreciate just how far technology has come in crime solving, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. You can't help but wonder how many cold cases from back then could be solved with today's tech. But let's take a step back for a second. We should really talk about the victims for a minute. You know, their stories are crucial to really understanding this whole thing. Like one that really stood out in the research was this young professional woman, full of life, just starting her career.
Yeah.
And then there was an elderly woman who lived alone, just tragic. Each life cut way too short.
And those are just two of the victims. The fact that they were all so different really made profiling next to impossible. Were they chosen at random? Or was there some connection the investigators just couldn't see, some hidden motive? These questions really loomed over the whole investigation.
Right, so we've got this terrifying mystery unfolding. The entire city's on edge.
Yeah.
And then enters Albert DeSalvo. Now, DeSalvo was already in custody for a series of sexual assaults. And then all of a sudden, he confesses to being the Boston Strangler.
Yeah, talk about a plot twist. No one saw that coming.
Huh?
And his confessions were so detailed, he even knew things that hadn't been released to the public. For a while, it really seemed like the case was finally cracked. It was almost like the city could breathe again.
Yeah, but here's where things get really interesting, and where you really start to get into those Blinkist-level insights. Because even though DeSalvo's confessions were super detailed, they were also full of inconsistencies, like straight-up factual errors. And this made investigators seriously doubt him. Was he just looking for attention? Was he mentally unstable? Or was there something more to his confession?
Yeah, that's crucial. Because it led some experts to believe that maybe, just maybe, DeSalvo wasn't responsible for all of the murders. Could there have been multiple killers operating at the same time? Maybe even copycats taking advantage of the panic? I mean, you can't forget about the media frenzy at the time either.
That's a great point. You really have to imagine what it was like back then. No DNA testing to definitively link a suspect to a crime scene. Investigators were basically relying on old-school methods, which in this case seemed to be failing. It wasn't until 2013, decades later, that a huge development changed everything.
Oh, yeah. That's when they finally used DNA testing and linked DeSalvo to the final victim, Mary Sullivan. Finally, a solid piece of evidence.
Right. It definitively tied DeSalvo to one murder. But does that mean he was responsible for all 13? That's the question, isn't it? Was it one killer, or were there others hiding in plain sight?
Yeah, it's like you find one of the puzzle pieces and then realize the whole box is missing half the pieces. This is where the case gets even more fascinating, especially when you look at the psychology of it all. Experts have spent years, decades even, trying to figure out a profile for the Boston Strangler. But it's been almost impossible.
You know, I was reading one of the articles that was saying how a lot of traditional serial killer profiling relies on finding patterns in who they choose as victims. But with the Boston Strangler, the victims are all so different, it completely throws those methods out the window.
Yeah.
Like trying to solve a riddle with half the clues missing.
Exactly. Some theories say the killer, or maybe killers, could have been psychopaths. You know, no empathy, driven by power and control. But when you look at DeSalvo's psych profile, while he did have a history of sexual assault and violence, his confessions were so inconsistent, so full of contradictions. that some psychologists think he might have just craved the attention, maybe even had a mental condition that led him to confess to crimes he didn't commit.
So we have a suspect who confessed, but his confessions are shaky at best, and the victims don't fit any of the typical profiles. It's enough to make your head spin. This is where the idea of multiple killers or copycat crimes starts to seem really plausible.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And remember, the media was all over this case.
Right.
Newspapers, radio, television, it was everywhere. And all that information, all that speculation flying around, it could have easily inspired other people to commit similar crimes. Maybe they wanted to be like the Strangler, or maybe they saw an opportunity in all the chaos and fear.
Wow, that's a scary thought. And it brings us to another important part of all this, the challenges law enforcement faced in the 1960s. We've talked about the lack of DNA tech. But they were up against so much more, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, today we have all these databases, advanced communication, agencies can share information in seconds. Back then, it was a completely different world. Imagine trying to put the pieces together in a complex case like this. You can't easily cross-reference suspects, share evidence, or quickly get info from other places. It was like trying to do their jobs with one hand tied behind their back.
That's crazy. It
Yeah.
must have been so frustrating for them, knowing there were potentially ways to solve this, but the tools just didn't exist yet. It really makes you appreciate how far we've come in forensics. The fact that they could even extract DNA from Mary Sullivan's remains after all those years
Yeah.
and link it to DeSalvo, that's incredible.
Yeah, it really is amazing what they can do now, but it also shows you just how complicated this case is. DeSalvo's DNA was a match for Sullivan, no doubt, but that doesn't automatically mean he did all 13 murders. It's like finding the key to one door, but realizing you need a whole other set of keys for the rest of the house.
It's like taking one step forward and then two steps back. Which leads us to the impact the Boston Strangler case has had, not just on Boston, but on how we investigate crimes today. Can you imagine? One case changing an entire field.
It really did.
It's true.
I mean, the Boston Strangler case is the reason we have things like criminal profiling and behavioral science units in law enforcement. It forced investigators to dig deeper, to really understand the psychology of the offender, what drives them, how they behave. It was groundbreaking at the time.
And its impact goes way beyond the police and the FBI, though, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, all the media attention on the Boston Strangler case, it brought up some serious ethical questions about the role of the media in these kinds of investigations.
Without a doubt, this case was one of the first to start a national conversation about sensationalism in the news versus responsible reporting. How much should the public know? How do you balance the public's right to know with protecting an investigation? We're still struggling with those questions today, especially with social media and 24/7 news.
It's true. And of course, we can't forget the impact on society itself. The Boston Strangler case scared a lot of people, especially women, and it made everyone think more about personal safety.
Yeah, people started locking their doors more, being more careful about strangers, taking steps to protect themselves.
Right. And it's a reminder that even though we've made huge progress in crime solving and forensics, the human element is still so important. Being aware, being careful, trusting your gut, those things are just as important today as they were back in the 1960s.
That's such a good point. So we've talked about the impact on law enforcement, the media, society as a whole. But what about the field of criminology itself? It's amazing how one case can completely change the way we think about crime.
It's true. The Boston Strangler case really challenged everything people thought they knew about serial killers and their victims. Criminologists had to rethink their theories, come up with new ways of understanding these types of crimes, and admit that the old ways of thinking didn't always apply. That's so interesting. And, this case, with all its twists and turns, it still fascinates people today. There are tons of books, documentaries, movies about it.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like everyone has their own theory about who the real Boston Strangler was.
Yeah.
Or if there was more than one.
It's true. And the crazy thing is, even with DeSalvo's DNA linked to one of the murders, people are still debating. Some experts are convinced he wasn't responsible for all of them. Others think there's something else going on that we might never figure out.
It's a case that keeps you thinking, even after all these years. I think that's what makes it so compelling. It reminds us that even with all the evidence in the world, there can still be questions without answers. And sometimes the truth is just out of reach.
And in the case of the Boston Strangler, that truth is still out there haunting us, like a whisper from the past, daring us to try and solve the puzzle, even though it might never be complete.
That's a great way to put it. When we come back, we'll dig into some of the most interesting theories that have come up over the years. And we'll explore why after all this time. The Boston Strangler case is still one of the most fascinating unsolved mysteries in American history.
Hmm.
So we've pretty much established that the Boston Strangler case isn't exactly a closed book. I mean, even with the DNA evidence pointing to DeSalvo, there are still so many questions left hanging. And of course, all the theories people have come up with over the years. What are some of the big ones that have really stuck around?
Well, one that's gotten a lot of attention is the idea that DeSalvo might have been a copycat killer. Not the original Boston Strangler. You got to remember how much the media was covering this case. It was everywhere. So it's definitely possible that someone else, or even multiple people, with who knows what messed up motivations, could have seen all that and decided to copy the crimes.
Yeah, like some twisted tribute almost.
Right, exactly.
And that actually makes sense when you think about it. Because some of the murders were carried out differently. Different MOs, different approaches.
Mm.
Almost like the killer, or killers, were changing things up.
Yeah, maybe they were learning as they went, or trying to throw off the investigation.
Pretty chilling when you think about it.
It is.
And if DeSalvo was just a copycat, then who committed those first murders? Couldn't it have been a group working together?
Mm.
Or was there one mastermind who just completely disappeared? My brain is officially fried right now.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
And it really shows you, even with all the progress we've made with forensics and technology, there are still some mysteries that might just never get solved.
It's true. And that's part of what makes the Boston Strangler case so fascinating. It's a reminder that sometimes, no matter how hard we try,
Yeah,
some things will always remain a mystery. It's like you're looking at a reflection in a broken mirror. You can see pieces of the image, but you can never fully put it back together.
that's such a good analogy. And, I
Yes.
think that's part of what draws us to these true crime cases. That sense of the unknown, the unanswered questions. It's like we're all trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense, trying to find a story, even in the middle of all the chaos.
Right. We crave a narrative,
Yeah,
and in a way, not having a clear answer almost makes it more intriguing.
I think so too.
It keeps the case alive in our minds. It makes us want to go back and look at the evidence again, analyze all the theories, and wonder if we'll ever really know the truth.
So for our listeners out there, what's the takeaway from all of this? Why should we still care about a case that happened over 50 years ago?
Well, I think the Boston Strangler case is a reminder that we can never be too careful. Even today, it's so important to be aware of your surroundings. Trust your gut and do what you need to do to stay safe. We may have better tools and technology now, but personal safety is just as important as ever.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it also shows how important it is for law enforcement to keep evolving. We've come a long way since the 1960s, but there's always room for improvement. New techniques, new technology, anything that can help solve crimes and bring justice to the victims.
That's right. And maybe most importantly, this case teaches us to think critically, to question everything, to really look at the evidence, and be open to different points of view, because sometimes the truth is a lot more complicated than we think.
Well said. If you're as fascinated by the Boston Strangler as we are, and I mean, come on, how could you not be? We really encourage you to do your own research.
Yeah, there's so much out there.
There are tons of books, documentaries, articles, all waiting to be explored.
It's a rabbit hole worth going down.
Yeah.
But fair warning, you might end up with more questions than answers.
And you know what? Sometimes that's the best part. The mystery, the unanswered questions, the chance that the truth is still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.